Well, today I'm going to tell you the story of Robert. You see, Robert was born in a little house on the prairie in 1924. He was born on the same land that his great great grandparents had homesteaded on in 1871, after they had moved from Chicago after the Chicago fire had wiped out Chicago. Why, they say his great great grandma, when she moved out here, said, "You brought me out here to die," which she did, but not until many years later. You see, Robert grew up in nature. Why, they say by the time he was just 3 years old, that he could look at the clouds and tell you that he could go out and sniff the air and tell you when a storm was coming, or he could look at the clouds and tell you when a tornado might come. Why, when he went to school, by then he was already trapping, and he'd trap on the way to school, and sometimes he'd even get a skunk. Now, you might not be very excited about skunks, but boy, Robert was. You see, back then a skunk was worth $5, and that was a lot of money back then. Now, he would wait until he was coming home to pick up the skunk so the smell of the skunk would dissipate a little bit, and then he'd take it home. And he grew up, and one day tragedy struck. You see, his dad was a farmer, and one day his dad didn't come home from the farm. And they went out and looked for him, and they found out that his father had had a heart attack. And this was devastating to the whole family. But that year, all the local farmers came out and they helped harvest the fields. But the next year, it was Robert's turn. And Robert worked hard, but he always wished that he had a helping hand. And one day, he got his wish. A helping hand did show up, but it was just a hand, unattached from a body. Now, at first, this freaked Robert out, as it would most people. But when he saw how hard that hand could work, he liked having that helping hand. Why, within a couple of years, he was able to train that helping hand to do everything on the farm. And at that point, he had to drop out of school, but he was able to go back to school because that helping hand was able to help him do the work. And he finished high school in 1944. And as you know, that's when World War II was going on. And Robert joined the Navy. And he told the helping hand goodbye and told him to help Mom on the farm. And he went off to Chicago, to training facility. And they trained him well, but every once in a while he'd make a small mistake. And the sergeant would say, "What you think you doing, Kansas? Pitching hay?" And this inspired Robert to work harder, and he learned all the things that he needed to learn. And one weekend, they had the weekend off, and he was able to go home, and he took the bullet train. They say it only took 12 hours to go from Chicago to Denver back then on the bullet train, and he hitchhiked the rest of the way home. And do you know how he hitchhiked home? The helping hand showed up to thumb him a ride and get him a ride back home. And he got back to Chicago within 72 hours. And when it was just about time for him to be released for his assignment in the war, he got sick. You see, he ended up getting scarlet fever, and he was quarantined for a few weeks. But at night, the helping hand would come, and it would bring his mother's chicken noodle soup and mashed potatoes, and it would help him get better. And he did get better, and he did end up getting assigned to the Caribbean. His job was to travel was on a ship, to go with a rubber ship, because rubber was needed from the war, and they had to get it from South America. And sometimes, most of the time, he did like it on the ship, but once in a while he would get homesick. And sometimes he would get a letter from his mama. "Dear Robert, I do miss you, but the helping hand is doing well. I hope that everything is well out on the ship." And Robert would write back, "Dear Mama, I miss you too. All is well most of the time, but the food, it isn't nearly as good as yours. And the next time that they landed on the port in Florida, there was a note that the helping hand delivered, and there was a box of brownies. And the note said, "Dear Robert, I can't stand that you aren't having good food on that ship. Here's a box of brownies." And Robert wrote back, "Dear Mama, thank you for the brownies. I shared them with the crew, and now they consider you their Navy Mama. P.S. I think the war will be ending soon." And the war did end soon in 1945, and Robert was able to go home. He was no longer among the waves of the ocean, but once again he was back with the waves of grain, and he settled back down on the farm. And one day, when he was at the grocery store, he felt a tap on the shoulder, and it was the helping hand. And then it pointed to a young woman named Alice that was in his class. And if that wasn't enough, the helping hand made a little mouth gesture and pointed at her again. And Robert went over and started talking to her, and the next thing you know, they were courting, and 6 months later, they got married, and that's how the helping hand helped Robert get a new helping hand. And they settled in on the farm, and his mother, she moved to the town, and they took over the farm. And they enjoyed farming together, and it was about a year and a half later that Robert and Marie had a baby, and they named that baby Jim. And you know what? Jim was born with his own helping hand. Why, at night, when Robert and Marie were sleeping, the helping hand would be there, rocking the cradle, helping Jim stay asleep. And the helping hand would play games with Jim, like patty cake. Patty cake, baker's man. Bake me a cake as fast as you can. Pat it and roll it and put it in a pan. Patty cake, baker's man. And when he got to school, turned out Jim was really good at math. You see, most kids, they only had 10 fingers. But Jim, he had 15. And he was able to learn math faster than anyone. Why, you know what? He grew up, and he went off to college, and he made a life for himself. And Robert and Marie, they aged, and sometimes Robert would fall down and need a helping hand to get back up, and there was that helping hand to help pull him back off the ground. And Robert and Marie aged as they do, and one day Marie passed on to the next life, and Robert was left alone with his helping hand. And one day, Robert noticed the pigment of his helping hand was starting to fade, and he knew that his time was coming soon also. And one day, the helping hand completely lost all of its pigment, and it disappeared, and that was the day that Robert passed on. But at Robert's funeral, there was the helping hand with a glove on, helping carry Robert's casket to the grave. And that helping hand, well, it's still around today. Do you ever feel like you can do more things in a day than you think you can? Do you ever have a little extra strength? Perhaps that's your helping hand. And guess what? If someday you don't feel like you have a helping hand, guess what? I have helping hands too. And I bet you that there are a lot more helping hands in the audience tonight.